Egypt is an empire dominated by water. Whoa, you got the coin. Oh, hey bud, you wanna come help? Okay, come help. Huh, we're doing this. Do it the right way. Okay. How's it going, party people? I know it's kind of a weird thing to say about a desert nation, which, I mean, it's pretty cool. I want to go check it out. I want to go see the pyramids. The reason that I say that Egypt is an empire based on water is because its entire existence revolves around the Nile. To understand the Nile, we need to understand first dirt. All right, before you get all pedantic on me, yes, I understand it's soil, but soil is one of those words that you just say over and over and over again, and it doesn't sound like a real word. So I'm just gonna say dirt, probably because I'm kind of a redneck and dirt is just, I don't know, it's easier for me to say. But dirt, aka soil, comes from erosion of rocks and decomposed plant matter. What really matters to us right now is eroded rock. You might think, okay, rock is just, it's whatever, it's just rock. But inside rock are minerals, and you break them down into essentially their tiniest little bits, and we call those mineral salts. Now, different types of rocks have different kinds of mineral salts, which different kinds of plants do better or worse in. Why are we talking about salt? Well, your plants need salt. It's Gatorade. It's what the plants crave. Lord have mercy, I am sweating. Now, at the source of the Nile, there are really rocky mountains that experience an annual deluge. And we're not just talking simple rain, we're talking a gully washer, if you will. Just the rain comes down and pours and just, and that lasts, for days and days and days, sometimes even months off and on. It's not a constant torrential downpour, but you get what I mean. That causes a huge amount of erosion. And then all that erosion, which then becomes silt, full of those mineral salts that we talked about before, and that gets pushed down the Nile. Egypt and that whole area is relatively flat, so the Nile River banks really flood outwards and outwards, or at least they used to before the High Aswan Dam, which we're going to get to way later in this episode. But we're talking thousands and thousands of years ago. The basin of the Nile would flood, and as the annual floodwaters receded, what remained was water in the ground, was a really temporary shallow groundwater, but more importantly, this great big silt deposit that was excellent for growing crops. Or just plants in general, but people, we like to plant things that we like to eat. Now, this probably doesn't come as a shock to anybody, but soil needs to have its nutrients replenished. Now, we do that in modern times, typically with chemical fertilizer and with poop. Everything comes back to poop. It all comes back to poop. We get nitrogen for the poop, and we get mineral salts from the poop, and from green matter from the waste. Guys, it's all poop. I'm the internet poop god. I don't think there's gonna be a single video where I don't mention poop, because yeah, it all ties back to it. Now, you know how I talked about the flood leaving water in the ground for the plants to grow up, and that's good, but in an arid climate, that can actually be kind of a bad thing. Whenever there's nothing to stop evaporation, what happens is you get capillary evaporation. Now, what happens is these mineral salts, they go up and they follow the water through these little bitty channels. They're called capillary channels. And they get deposited because they're heavier than the water. They don't float up into the sky and evaporate. They get deposited onto the ground and actually leave the ground kind of salty. When you're trying to grow crops, salt on top of the soil is not a good thing. A little bit of salt, really good for plants. A lot of salt, really bad for plants. However, again, not a problem with the annual flooding. That just washes all the salt away, gives you more silt. You're good to go. Now, the Nile Basin has been more or less occupied since the dawn of humans. But people didn't really start coming there in force until the Sahara started drying up. Now, there's several different reasons and several different theories as to why the previously lush and riverine plains, big words, that the lush and riverine plains of the Sahara eventually dried up. Part of it is the Earth actually moved on its axis. It changed its axial tilt and it got more sun and it dried up. Another part is the human inhabitants there clear-cut all of the forests, which cause the desertification. Essentially, if you remove all of the trees in a given area, you'll eventually cause a desert to happen. It's happened around the world many, many times throughout all of human history. But those two things kind of combined and caused the Sahara to not be a habitable place anymore. Cool, what do? We gotta go live somewhere. We can't just dry up and die with the desert. We're humans, we have an innate will to survive. So they start looking for water, and eventually they wind up on the Nile Basin. Now the people from the Saharan plains, they came down, they either intermingled or they drove out the people who were already there at the Nile Basin. Geneticists are still figuring it out. There's evidence of both happening. Now these people who were coming in from the Sahara had already done some pre-agriculture stuff. They had figured out plant these seeds or at least put the grain down, and more grain grows up later. So they came down and they had pre-agriculture already ready to go. They had that technology. So when they came into the Nile Basin, they realized really quickly, oh wow, this annual floodplain stuff is awesome. Stuff grows and it is so cool. Early farming was really chill, especially in the alluvial plains of Egypt and Mesopotamia. You just throw some seeds on the wet dirt, you hang out, you drink some beer, and then you go harvest. And rinse, repeat. Actually, that sounds pretty good. I want to drink beer and hang out for like 9 months of the year. Where's that job? Early farmers did figure out really quickly that plants grow better when you dig a little trough. The most common method for digging a trough was just taking a branch and dragging it behind you. I gotta say, I appreciate the laziness of it. Could they have built a tool for it? Yes, they built tools all the time. Humans have been building tools for about 2.5 million years. But guys, we got beer to go drink. We're gonna be lazy about this. We're gonna go find some branch off a scrub brush. We're just gonna drag it behind us, throw our seeds, call it a day. But they did eventually build a tool called the ard. It was actually imported from Mesopotamia, which the ard is really just kind of a stick. Sometimes it's a 3-pronged stick that kind of curves down. Again, you've seen it. You've seen this in your Egyptian classes or your Mesopotamian classes, but they were still only used human power. They weren't using livestock for power. Now that's not to say they didn't have livestock. They absolutely did. After the harvest, they would transform their fields into grazing area, which of course everything goes back to poop. The animals would graze and of course they poop because everything goes back to poop, and nitrogen gets introduced into the soil. Nitrogen, poop, it's what the plants crave. And then some jerk comes around and is like, oh hey, we can store the floodwaters. Let's build some canals. Oh great, that sounds great, Larry. Let's just build canals. I had a good thing going. I was just gonna sit around and drink beer and do nothing and, you know, chase birds off my field. But no, we have to have perennial crops. That sounds like such a good idea. Also, Larry's the king now, because of course Larry's the king now. Why don't I get to be king, Larry? I be king, sit on my lawn chair and drink beer and watch you dig a hole. Let's say government sucks. Don't trust the government. Okay, where was I? Back to actual Egypt. Now, the major drawback to floodwater cultivation is that it only works part of the year. And when you live in a place like Egypt, well, you can farm temperature-wise year-round. So the ancient Egyptian people learned really quickly to build dikes and dams and canals to store both floodwater and the alluvia. Now these are great big public works projects, and they require intense, complex logistical planning. And it's thought that because they required so much complex logistical planning, that the waterworks in the Nile Delta is what gave rise to the first city-states in Egypt. Now when you think about these giant projects that happened in the ancient world, whether they be the pyramids, whether they be the canals, whether they be the storing of floodwater, is you gotta really remember that human cost just wasn't factored in, whether it was slave labor, paid labor, or taxed labor, which we'll get into shortly. The human cost, whether or not, 100 people or 1,000 people died while doing this, it just wasn't factored in. So when you look at these giant works projects, they say, well, how did they do it? How did they do it? Well, it's because they didn't care how many people or how long it took to complete it. They just did it. And that's why we don't build giant pyramids now, because we actually care if Bob dies on the construction site. It's a pretty common misconception that all of these public works were done by slave labor. They actually weren't. Most labor was done as a form of paying tax. Throughout most history, especially Egyptian history, there were two kinds of taxation. One, taxation in kind, so that is giving whatever you grow, whatever you create, whatever you produce, you give a portion of that to the government to fill their stores. Or you pay taxation in labor. And so if you were a peasant in ancient Egypt, you would spend part of your year farming, and the rest of the year you would spend working on these great big public works projects. That was your way of paying taxes. Now, a longitudinal basin is the easiest. It's just a big, long basin of water. Now, sometimes they would connect these longitudinal basins together, so you'd have just a chain. They would go pretty much along the path of the river. So as the river went down, the basins would go down. There would be earthen dams in between each of these basins. And when your lowest basin got drained of all the water, they would cut a hole in the earthen dam and they would drain the water. And then they would do the same thing, just going down the line. Now, transverse basins are a little bit more complicated. They're basically a square and you have them kind of in like a pyramidal shape, and it goes up and then they drain kind of in this long pyramidal. Some of them do more of a step like the longitudinal basins, but the most common is kind of a pyramidal. It goes down and it's the same thing. Top goes in, and then as they get drained, you cut in sluice gates, boom, boom, boom. That's great for storing water, but you can't actually take that water very far inland before you start just getting all kinds of problems. And that's where we get the first major technological development in Egyptian agriculture, the shadoof. It's a fun word, shadoof. Sounds like it should be like a scrub brush to me. But you've probably seen pictures of it. You probably saw it when you did your ancient Egypt in school. The shadoof is the bucket that's on a lever. You dip the bucket down into the water, it's up, and then it moves around, and they dump the bucket into the next canal. There was a very long, labor-intensive process, but it allowed them to move water further and further inland, giving them more and more more land they could irrigate. That allowed the ancient Egyptians to plant more and more crops, which then allowed the Egyptian population to boom. Typically before this, in both slash and burn and alluvial plain agriculture, there's a population cap. Once you reach that cap, either people starve to death with famine, or more commonly, a group of people goes out and they go find another place to go farm, to go survive. And that's one of the ways that you get massive migrations of language and genetics all throughout the world, starting in one central place, and then they go and they leave because they're looking for more places to eat. Because again, who wants to starve to death? That sucks. But the ancient Egyptians, with their technologies that they had developed, with the shadoof, with the canals, with the floodwater, with holding on to the silt and the water, that allowed their population to boom up to 5 million, which in the ancient world is insane. You know, we're talking about a big country was thousands of people, and Egypt was dealing in millions of people, which again gave them the manpower, the labor, to be able to build these awesome, fantastic works that still stand to this day. Some of them stand in the British Museum because they stole it. For their country, they just go in, they're just like, ha, we want it, we're gonna steal it. They actually were going to try to take one of the pyramids, but the rocks were too big. They would just sink the ships. And so Britain for a while was trying to build a ship that was large enough to transport the blocks of the Great Pyramid. Didn't work, obviously, because it's stupid. Actually, I shouldn't say that because it probably gave them ideas now. We probably can do that. There's some curator in the British Museum going, the technology exists now. All right, going back to the actual topic. At this time, Egypt was divided into the southern and the northern kingdom. Because they were able to control the water, the southern kingdom gained strategic superiority over the northern kingdom, and eventually they were able to forcibly unify the entire country of Egypt. And this still happens to this day. Water control is a hugely, hotly contested thing. Who controls the water really controls a lot of the power. This really just goes to show that a lot of ancient problems have never really been solved. We're still dealing with them to this day, to the modern day. I don't know if there is a solution other than, I don't know, stop drinking all the water, which I'm not gonna do. I'm gonna keep drinking water. But I don't know. Now, Egypt is really a study in cause and effect. You do a good thing and something bad or not so good comes out of it. A consequence of all this canal and basin building was, yes, they got more and more land that they could irrigate and grow more crops on, but it was destroying pasture land that the animals, specifically their livestock, were using to graze. So they had to come up with new ways to feed the livestock. And so part of their crop rotation, they had to grow fodder for their livestock. What the ancient Egyptians planned to feed their livestock were legumes. And if you know anything about farming and rotational farming, legumes are an essential thing to plant because they also introduce nitrogen to the soil. Whoa, finally, something that is not poop-related nitrogen fixation. Thank. I don't know, what's a Set. Yes, that's an Egyptian god. I was trying to think of an Egyptian god. Ra. Why was Ra not my first thing that I went to? Ra is like the Egyptian god. That might be a whole different episode as the Egyptian gods and when they went to monotheism with just Ra worship and then went back to polytheism. Anyway, back on track. Legumes create nitrogen fixation in the soil. And so as a result, the next thing that they would plant, usually Egyptian clover or some kind of cereal grain. No, they didn't plant Kellogg's. That'd be kind of funny. I think every time I read cereal grains and I immediately think, oh, they're just taking Frosted Flakes and just shaking them out on the soil. I know that's not but that's how my brain interprets it, and it's really funny. Now, this was called biennial crop rotation, and in the 1700s, there was, in Europe, there was a thing called New Agriculture, and they were promoting biennial crop rotation. And that just really goes to show that ancient people were not primitive. They were not these stupid, knuckle-dragging, me, ho, Yes, they were drunk all the time, but that's a whole different thing. But you know what? Give Grog a computer, give Grog or Caveman a computer, he'll dominate you in a week. He'll be able to just hack the Pentagon, he'll hack China, he'll hack everything. He's coming up with all kinds of crazy codes. I'm gonna rant about this probably every single episode because we talk about ancient people all the time. And I don't know, it's really dumb. It's like, oh, ancient people, they were primitive, they were dumb. No, they just didn't know stuff because they were literally writing the book. They were figuring it out on the fly. We can look back at ancient history, which is really cool. We can look back at ancient history and we can see the problems that they had and we can find the solutions. And a lot of times those solutions translate into our current problems. We still use biennial crop rotation to this day in the modern world. Now, with biennial crop rotation, their population exploded again. Ancient Egypt was able to support 300 people per square cultivated kilometer. That's crazy. Before that, slash and burn agriculture was kind of the number one thing. And that is, let me look at my notes, that is 30 times the amount what slash and burn agriculture can support. Now, yes, we are going to do an episode just on slash and burn agriculture because it's fascinating, but just know slash and burn agriculture can't actually support that many people. But Egypt went away from slash and burn probably because there was really nothing to slash and burn, and their population exploded, and that's why they were really the powerhouse of the ancient world. Now you have 5 million people, and these people need to be controlled. And so what ancient Egypt came up with was a kind of not party system, but a two-pronged system. You had the religious and you had the civil, you had the state. The religious side gave legitimacy to the civil side by saying, you know, like, hey, the Pharaoh is a god. He's descended from Ra. He is a living, walking god on earth. And in turn, the civil gave legitimacy to the religious, usually in the form of they would pay taxes to them. So you had to pay taxes to the religious. So if you're a peasant, you're paying taxes not only to the civil side, but you're also paying taxes to the religious side. Again, taxes in kind and taxes in labor. Now, this probably sounds familiar because in medieval Europe, they did a very similar thing with the Catholic Church. In medieval Europe, on paper, the Pope had to approve a king rising to power. Now, it didn't one-to-one exactly work that way, which that's a whole different episode that's probably going to make a lot of people really mad, no matter how you land on it. But you know what? History is history, and history doesn't care about your feelings. And I'm not saying that medieval Europe copied ancient Egypt. They didn't. It was completely separate, completely unique thing. They were completely unique. But it is interesting, throughout history, we see humans finding problems and coming up with the same solution over and over and over again. I'm not saying it's the best solution, but it is interesting that humans come up with the same solution again and again. Now, how were the ancient Egyptians able to have large populations of non-producing persons, aka the civil service and the religious service? Well, booms in farming technology allow for non-producing, aka non-farming, non-ranching people to be able to exist because you have a surplus of food. Now, ancient Egypt had so much of a surplus that by the 8th century BCE, they were trading wheat with Greece. Now, and one major thing that trade with Greece introduced into Egypt was currency, specifically coin currency. This was both a good thing and a bad thing because up until this point, all of the taxation was done with either taxation in kind or taxation in labor. And so now you have the state wanting currency. So they're not only demanding taxation in kind, taxation in labor, they're also demanding currency, which put more and more pressure on the working and farming class of the Egyptian society. And that is really when you can kind of look at it and say, hey, this is kind of where the decline starts to happen in the Egyptian empire, really the purely Egyptian empire. Because shortly after that, and by that couple hundred years, you have the Greek invasion of Egypt. Now, Egyptian technology hadn't really advanced since the shadoof, which is the bucket thingy, where you bucket water. So the Greeks brought in things like the Archimedean screw, which allowed them to dig deep, deep wells and then use the screw. They would turn it in big circles, and that would bring water up from the ground and allowed for deep wells to be dug. Now the Arabs bring in animal traction, which for the first time, Egyptians are now using animal power to turn their Archimedean screws, to plow their fields, which why it took that long, I have no idea. It's kind of crazy. But it wasn't until the Arab conquest that came in and introduced in 640 that they started using animals to replace humans. It's just like computers now. Animals taking our jobs. I just imagine some Egyptian farmer going, "Took our jobs." Now we're going to jump way forward in time to the 1800s. In the 1800s, Egypt was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. The guy the Ottomans put in charge of Egypt was a man named Muhammad Ali. No, not the boxer. He was a totally different guy, actually different spelling. But Muhammad Ali was determined to drag Egypt into the modern era. Now, Muhammad Ali is actually a really interesting guy because not only was he trying to drag Egypt into the modern era, he was kind of progressive and kind of not. In one of the ways that he was progressive, he allowed women to be doctors. He actually set up a school for women to be doctors. Now, it's not because he cared about women's rights or wanted to further the cause of women or anything like that. He actually wanted a larger and healthier population so that he could have a bigger military in Egypt. So he wanted more babies to be born and to survive into adulthood so they could go die later in some war. Now, one of the ways that Muhammad Ali started bringing Egypt into the modern era was he started damming the Nile. He started with these branches off of the Nile. He would dam those, and it was really low, shallow dams at first, and they started building up and building up and building up. That created more and more area that they could irrigate and grow more crop, which was actually really good for Egypt at that time because around that time, Egyptians started growing cotton. Now, cotton wasn't really a big export for Egypt for a really long time until the 1860s. Now, if you're paying attention to history and you're thinking cotton, 1860s, why is this important? Can you guess? It's the American Civil War. Now, at the time, America was the largest exporter of cotton. But, you know, we had this whole disagreement over whether or not you can own people. America was obviously not exporting cotton because, you know, war. Egypt now stepped into the world market as the largest producer and exporter of cotton. Now, in the mid-1800s, Europe had kind of just discovered and was starting to perfect mass marketing. And so they started mass marketing Egyptian cotton. And to this day, that's why Egyptian cotton is still such a big deal. Is it substantially different from American grown cotton or cotton grown really anywhere else in the world? No, it's not. It's the same. You are just paying a premium for Egyptian cotton because somebody in the 1800s wasn't able to get their cotton from the US, so they started buying cotton from Egypt and started marketing it as better. Another war happened, Britain got control of Egypt, and Britain really, really likes their cotton. So they started growing more and more cotton in Egypt than ever before. It was replacing foodstuffs. Now, cotton is a very water-hungry plant. It's a thirsty lady, and that required more and more damming of the Nile. So that resulted in the creation of the Lower Aswan Dam, the first time the Nile itself had actually been dammed. Up until this point, they had just dammed bifurcations of the river. Now they dammed the river itself. Yeah, Yeah, we had to take a break because the battery died. There you go. Yeah. Doing better. Okay. Like that. And then later they would build the Upper Aswan Dam, which created a massive lake and created a ton more land that could be irrigated and used for farming in Egypt. Now, in another example of do one thing and an unintended thing happens, the Aswan Dam, yes, provides water, but deprives the Lower Nile of all of the silt, all of the minerals that make the crops grow really, really well. So it's just piling up against the Aswan Dam. And so in order to get good crop yields, Egypt has to import massive amounts of chemical fertilizers, which honestly isn't that bad of a thing. The whole world does it, but really, if you have the option of using something natural that's just provided by nature, use that and supplement with chemical fertilization. But Egypt also has lower crop yields than in the past, and Egypt has to import most of its food. Whereas, remember, it used to be exporting food. It had so much of a surplus, they traded with Greece. Another unintended consequence of the Aswan Dam is an increase in groundwater. Now, okay, you might be thinking, cool, that's a good thing, right? Groundwater equals more plants can grow. Well, remember way back in the beginning of the episode when I talked about capillary evaporation. In an arid environment, a whole bunch of groundwater that's close to the surface, it evaporates because of the heat, and it goes up through these little bitty capillaries, but the mineral salts are left on the soil, and that decreases the arability of the soil, your ability to farm and the ability to grow plants, which is pretty important if you're farming. Because Egypt is naturally hot, its water has an increased saline level because it sits in the lake and it goes through the irrigation channels. It evaporates. They actually evaporate 30% of their water. It's absolutely insane. And so what gets left behind are all these mineral salts. And so the water has a higher saline level, which creates, again, decreased crop yields. Now, Egypt is doing stuff to combat the evaporation, such as making their irrigation channels, all of their canals. They're putting a lot of those underground. It's pretty freaking cool. So where does that leave us? Was the Aswan Dam a mistake? It kind of depends on who you ask. You ask the Egyptian government and they say it's fantastic. You ask the Egyptian farmers and you might get a mixed response. I guess the point is every action has a consequence. And if you're massively changing your environment, you might find yourself changing it in a way that you really didn't intend and may not be the best thing for you. Anyways, thanks for sticking around. I know this was a long one. Please like, comment, subscribe, press that notification button. All of those things really help out the channel. Lets YouTube know that you like what I'm doing here. I will see you party people next time.